Divya Kolar, Marketing Working Group co-chair. So I welcome you all to the webinar that is conducted by Jesse Martinez today. Before we begin on the presentation, I would like to do some housekeeping things. If you have questions, I encourage attendees to ask the questions throughout the presentation. Just find the right opportunity to speak up. Or the other way to do it is if you are on your computer and if you're using a Zoom application, there is a feature when you click on Participants tab to raise hand. So Jesse is monitoring that. If there are questions, you can raise your hand and Jesse will give you an opportunity to ask a question during his talk. This webinar is being recorded for future reference. It may also be hosted on our website. So I want all the participants to be aware of this recording opportunity that we are using here. I'd like to take a moment to welcome Jesse Martinez. He is the technical lead for the HPC Networking Team within HPC Systems Group at Los Alamos National Labs. He, as a HPC networking administrator, manages the infrastructure for LAN's production systems capability, and he works on Ethernet, InfiniBand, OmniPath high-speed networks. In the past, he has presented his work in workshops at OFA conference. He has also presented at Shalishan HPC conference. He has conducted workshops at TAPIA 2017 and 2018 conferences. It is a great opportunity for OpenFabrics Alliance to have him speak today. So I welcome Jesse. Jesse, go ahead. Please take away the presentation.
Thank you, Divya. Again, my name is Jesse Martinez. I've been attending the OFA workshops for the past couple years. I'm still relatively a newbie, I would say, in the world of RDMA. I'm still learning as much as I can as I go. Very much still a sysadmin in terms of working with all these technologies. So I definitely come from the sysadmin world of trying to approach how all these technologies work together and how we can utilize them better going forward. So that's kind of what this presentation today is going to be focusing on, is just the experiences as we as a sysadmin community work with these fabrics, how we interact with them, how can we make them better and or give feedback to the OFA community itself and the vendors to kind of raise some concerns that we have with administering these types of fabrics. And ways that we can improve them going forward. So, Divya, if you want to go to the next slide. So mostly what we're going to be talking about today is just these types of diverse fabrics that we work with through the OFA community, and then within your own homegrown architecture that you work with, and then how we are affected by these changes that are always growing day to day with new technologies. New ways to do things. How can we stay on top of how the vendors and other people who are implementing these types of changes, how can we stay on top of that to make sure we're not left behind and kind of fighting for ourselves to understand what's going on. It's an ever-growing world of these network technologies, so it's hard to maintain our stance with what's going on. And so we're trying to see if we can find out how we're being affected that way and how we can improve going forward. So that requires us to understand how these fabrics are managed today, what are certain things that people have that they utilize, what they understand and what they use going forward with trying to keep on top of these types of changes, the ways that we can standardize these types of changes and ways to utilize these fabrics and maintain them, ways of documenting that for other people who are also coming into this brand new and are interested in finding some documentation on how to administer these fabrics. And then a path forward as to how we can approach this so that way we're all on the same page going forward and how we can give feedback to the rest of the community to make sure our voices are heard. And then we'll go over some important information at the very end as well too. Divya, the next slide, please. So again, approaching this, for those of you who aren't too familiar or haven't been attending any of the OFA workshops or brand new to this technology in general, what are we talking about when we say diverse fabrics? So it's basically anything that we've been working with in terms of the OFA community itself, whether it be Ethernet, InfiniBand, the different versions of Rocky that have been coming out, iWarp, and then any vendor proprietary networks like the Intel OmniPath architecture or any of the Crane networks like Gemini, Aries networks, things like that. And so you can see there's quite a wide range of all these different types of technologies that we deal with on a day-to-day basis, whether it be for high-performance computing, any other storage solutions like Lustre, IBM products, things like that, and then the rest of the industry who makes use of these high-speed networks in general. There's many people out there who utilize it, and in order to maintain it, need to understand how it works from a fundamental point of view, as well as maintain it for any issues that go forward as we approach that. And then any other future technology that comes down the line as well too. It's important for us to understand, we as the admins who help maintain these, or even if you're a user of these technologies as well too, how can we utilize these to the best of our users and provide the best work going forward to get the most use out of it. So, so when we say that diverse fabrics, this is what we mean, and it's not limited to just these technologies as well too. Like I said, it's any future technologies, anything else out there that you're trying to utilize for high performance computing, for high bandwidth technologies, things like that. This definitely affects us from all different points of view, wherever you maintain these types of networks. So, Debbie, the next slide, please. So again, to kind of repeat what we kind of talked about at the OFA workshop this past year, for those of you who attended the 2018 OpenFabrics Alliance workshop. We as a task had wanted to approach this idea of how we as sysadmins deal with this reality of ever-changing fabrics. How do we integrate these fabrics together? How do we use them in our day-to-day lives? And so we came up with a wide range of questions and fundamental issues that we wanted to solve as part of a think tank during the workshop itself. And we got a lot of good response from it, but we wanted to keep this going. And so that's one of the main purposes of this webinar today, is to continue that conversation, to get other feedback from you, those that are attending. And as we come up with more issues or other things that we want to solve, how can we keep this going forward from our point of view as sysadmins? So again, those great questions that we had were, what were the biggest challenges that we as sysadmins face when we try to integrate these fabrics into our workplace, whether it be those items listed on the previous slide or any other types of networks that you maintain, or if you're just doing it for the fun of it as well too. How can we, as a sysadmin community, come together to kind of identify what those challenges are? Is there somewhere that we as the community itself can come together to develop this knowledge base from all of our different points of view? I know for myself in Los Alamos, we maintain our own documentation and kind of training that we do locally for some of our sysadmins here. I'm sure many of you at your other sites do the exact same thing for your new hires or anybody else helping you out with administering these fabrics. We have all this information spread out across the different vendors, the OFA community in general. Is there some way that we can kind of combine all that together to build this kind of repertoire of information as we move forward, to kind of consolidate it, see what works, find ideas that people have come up with, things like that to help us out as we go forward with understanding this technology, and then again, moving forward with any future developments or expansions from that. And then with that, go back to the previous slide, David, sorry. And so with that, is there something that we can come up with that we can standardize and help the community understand these points of view, whether it be from the network itself, from a greater visibility of what we as the admins or users see on the network side? Is there something that we can standardize, whether it be tools, ways that these fabrics are administered, things like that, to help us all come to an understanding of how we want to administer it, that would help us in the long run? Or does it make more sense to keep it separate for all these different technologies, whether it be vendor-based, user-based, things like that? So those would be kind of the questions that we answered. And then the idea of interoperability is one of the biggest concerns that we have as a community as well too. With all these different technologies emerging, it seems to be more and more the case that there needs to be something that helps us integrate these technologies together, depending on how we use them in our daily lives. Whether it be integrating these different types of fabrics for a production sense, testing and making sure different types of hardware that should be doing the same thing, following the spec, work together. So this idea of interoperability is a very big concern with the community today, especially now that we have the vendors kind of developing their own hardware and software for these diverse fabrics. How can we make sure that they stay in sync with what the true nature is of whether it be already made fabrics or any other technology that we deal with? So these are the big questions that we have today that we want to make sure we can stay on top of and make sure we don't lose in the wind. Next slide, please. So today, how we manage these fabrics, again, I come from the point of view as a sysadmin. I'm in no way a developer for any of these tools, things like that. I do help support some of the homegrown stuff that we at Los Alamos do here, and we've been trying to get out more into the community. But we want to find out what other ways that people are managing their fabrics. And so I open that up to people at the end if they want to share any of their concerns and things like that. But from a sysadmin point of view, how can we help identify the similarities and the differences of how we maintain these fabrics? And can we kind of consolidate that in a sense that makes sense for moving forward with managing these fabrics, whether it be at the kernel level of making sure everything is upstream and presented to all the distros or all the hardware vendors in an easy sense. Should we redefine these use cases for managing these fabrics to more of a general use and help have the vendors in the community itself try to come together to help consolidate all these tools and use cases for these fabrics, or does it make sense to keep it separate? We've been talking a lot at the previous OFA workshops that it seems that there's a divergence of a lot of these technologies from the vendor level as well as user level of how we view these fabrics and how we want to maintain them. Does it make sense to keep these different paths going forward, or does it make sense to try to keep them together to make it more useful in our eyes, things like that. And on top of that, there are many tools that we as sysadmins use in general to help diagnose these fabrics if there's any issues. Most of it comes from the OFA community itself that gets pushed upstream with different tools for diagnosing these fabrics. I know InfiniBand has a lot, OmniPath has a lot, things like that, but they're mostly starting to become more, again, vendor-based, or at least specific to that technology in general. Is there a way that we can try to help identify those tools for diagnosing fabrics, things like that? But for most of us, our experiences, we probably know that those don't solve all the issues when we manage these fabrics. What happens when we have what we call those subtle issues when the user says a job has been slowing down on the system? We see inconsistent network performance across the whole fabric where it was working fine one day and worse the next day with no changes on our side. How do we deal with different types of fabrics that people want to deploy with dynamic traffic on the network, such as like different storage solutions, I/O patterns, things like that? There are many questions that come up with when we try to debug tools or debug the fabrics like this. The tools don't always catch this. And I know many different people have come up with their own solutions for trying to help identify these subtle differences as we go forward. Here in Los Alamos, we developed our own monitoring software that interacts with the InfiniBand and OmniPath fabrics that we have to kind of help identify performance patterns, throughput of different ports on every switch on the fabric, things like that, to kind of help us identify where we may be seeing congestion that maybe the OpenSM counters aren't catching or the Fabric Manager counters aren't catching, to help us identify when the user reports to us, what's going on with my job, why is it slowing down the next day? But I know other different sites as well too have been coming up with their own different tools for utilizing these kind of use cases and how they can track different utilization of their fabric, things like that. So there are a lot of handy tools that come with the software for managing these fabrics, and we all interact with it in a different way. Is that something that we can share across the community to help be more in sync with how we identify these issues, a different vendor or different venue to help us share these tools, things like that. And then from the vendor point of view, I mean, they provide us these tools for approaching, identifying these issues, things like that, which I mentioned are very helpful for identifying issues on the fabric or just general information about these technologies. Is there something that we can push on the vendor community itself to make it more apparent as to how we utilize their tools, what works and what doesn't work for these different types of technologies? How can we identify which tools should be shared across these multiple technologies, or are they vendor specific? In this case, like Mellanox hardware versus Intel hardware for InfiniBand, things like that that we want to make sure is utilized for to the best of our knowledge for each vendor hardware. And then again, from the OS level as well too. A lot of the tools today are being pushed upstream, which is nice. But a lot of the vendors also put out a lot of best tuning parameters for how they should be interacting with the technology, whether it be for performance tuning, tuning for how your fabric is set up, things like that, whether it be the same hardware, etc. So there are many different tools out there that we can definitely make use of in our community, but the hardest challenge, I think, is identifying when and where those tools should be utilized to make the best out of it. And so I'm talking with a lot of people at the workshop this past year. That seemed to be one of their biggest issues that they have today, with that there are so many tools that do similar things, but it's hard to identify what gives us the best information and how to utilize it fully to make sure we understand what our networks are doing and how can we improve them, things like that. And then again, the biggest issue that we have today is that a lot of the upstream OS vendors have been providing their own distros for a lot of the software as well too. The OFA community helps try to maintain this overall, but from a vendor point of view, for the distros themselves, it makes more sense to fine-tune these software packages and drivers, things like that, for their own operating system, as well as the hardware that they expect that you'd be using those for that. So it's hard for us to kind of consolidate that together now that it is so vendor specific. And that's one of the greatest challenges that we have now is just understanding that divergence of maintaining these different distros as far as the stack for these technologies. But is there a way that we can kind of help identify what those changes are? Is there a way that we can consolidate them back together? Things like that. Go ahead and go to the next slide, Divya. And so with that, we talked about the idea of standardization. One of the biggest concerns is that we have so many different tools, we have so many different vendors, both software and hardware, that we need to understand when deploying our fabrics. Most of it is very similar, but a lot of it has diverged into making sure that those specific tools or software work with that particular vendor hardware, things like that. What can we define as our requirements for trying to administer these fabrics from this community that we can help supply back to the developers and the vendors on how we, from our experiences maintaining these fabrics, how can we provide information back to say, this is what works, this is what doesn't work. The tools that are provided make sense for this kind of environment. The documentation here says it should be working, but it may be a outdated tool that still provides good information but isn't maybe maintained anymore. Can we try to come up with a standardized way of making these tools more useful, both at the OS level and across the different technologies as well too? They may be asking for a lot, but these are the kind of questions that we've been hearing a lot from a lot of the community to maintain these fabrics, and I'm sure you have these types of questions as well too. We here at Los Alamos have to maintain many different types of monitoring tools just for the different technologies, where ideally they do the same thing depending on the technology, but there's many different ways to approach that from each vendor specific hardware. And so it would be nice to try to consolidate all these as much as we can and standardize on a way that both the admin interacts with the fabric as well as the user understands how the fabric should be used and the best way to interact with that, whether it be MPI processes, things like that, or just understanding overall the best way to fine tune a job for a specific fabric in general. And so one of the things that we came out of the discussions out of the workshop this past year was, can the OFA be one of those voices that we can have to kind of conceptualize what this standardization may look like? Talking with a lot of the people who were around when the OFA was kind of being developed, the overall purpose of it was to try to keep all these vendors, both OS and hardware, as close to possible as standardizing what should be presented out to the community, things like that. But as technology develops and new hardware and software ways of doing things come out, it's hard to kind of maintain that across all those different vendors and users of this technology. Does it make sense that it does need to be separate, or can we as the community itself kind of help push that back, try to be in sync as much as we can. It may not be possible. Again, these technologies are diverging quite a lot with the underlying use case of RDMA and other types of information like that. But it's a big question that we want to try to see, can we solve? Is it solvable? We don't know. It's something that we want to try to come up with and understand and get different input from different people in environments like this, where we can have quite a large voice and see what works and what doesn't work. And then there are ways, if there are ways that we can kind of push people to kind of follow these standards, things like that. It's hard to do this from approaching from a user admin point of view, where maybe we're kind of left in the dust to kind of fend for our own use cases, but we want to make sure that we're the ones that are using these technologies. What can we provide, and what can we kind of push back to the community, both developers and vendors, to say, we want to make sure this is what works for us. This would make more sense if we do it this way for this type of fabric. Yes, it does make sense to keep it separate for this type of technology, things like that. So if it needs to be separate, that's perfectly fine. It's just something that we need to kind of come up with on to help give that feedback back to say, this is what works and this is what doesn't work. On top of that, there may be ways just to overcome that. Like we mentioned here, Lano develops a lot of its own monitoring software to kind of overlay with these technologies and try to keep them in sync with how we maintain them. Is there a way that we as a community can try to develop wrappers or some other tools that interact with these fabrics in our own standard way, and just keep the vendors working on their tools and technologies separately, and then we as a sysadmin community come together to develop our own software to overlay on top of that, to utilize them, to try to keep conceptually same ideas, things like that. Next slide, Divya. So another big thing that came out of the workshop this past year was that, yes, there is a lot of good information out there that the vendors provide. There's a lot of good general forums and things like that that people have been documenting too. But I think that's one of the issues that we found, is that it is so diverse and spread out across multiple vendors and the community itself that it's hard to actually find something that is uniform for us to rely on. I know from my point of view that it's very difficult to kind of describe the best ways to maintain these fabrics and issues like that, just because we do utilize fabrics in many different ways. But I think the underlying fundamental resources that we have could be at least documented in a way that would be helpful for others who are either doing the same thing and or approaching the idea of maintaining the fabric in the same sense, whether it be very large scale, thousands of node type fabrics, or just a small rack of nodes that you do for testing, things like that. There are many different ways that we can help identify similarities between how we maintain these fabrics. So it doesn't make sense to try to develop our own documentation from an OFA community, us being sysadmins. We know how we work with the fabrics. We know how we can best maintain them. We have a lot of good ideas on how things can be done that we can share. Is there somewhere that we can kind of come together as a community and document these types of resources? For those who have been attending the workshop the past couple of years, you know that the OFA made a good effort to try to make good use of that and creating a wiki page on their main website where people can come request an account and kind of provide that information as well too. And it was utilized for the first few years, I would say, but has kind of fallen off the radar as our daily lives have taken over, things like that. And so I wanted to share with everybody that that wiki page does exist, but definitely has a lot of outdated resources based on when all the information was put out there. There's definitely a lot more that needs to be added to that wiki page that could be very useful for we as a community as we come together to approach this. That is one good venue I would say that the OFA can provide for us, is that since we are part of this community itself, it makes sense for the OFA to kind of provide that for us and kind of be a good centralized starting point, at least, for how we can come together to document all these different ways of administering and maintaining these fabrics from our point of view. But again, the biggest issue again comes with that is that there are many of us out there who have a lot of good ideas and resources it's hard to kind of maintain that in a useful sense from how we provide it. And so there may be something that we need to come up with to kind of standardize how that is consolidated together, so that way it doesn't get too out of hand. And then just in general, it's a place for us to share ideas and document things on how we do it. But if it's not maintained very well, like we've found out now these past couple of years, it's kind of hard to kind of keep that as a useful tool for how we maintain these fabrics. It's very useful if people are coming and starting off with the technology from a first-hand experience to get started. But as we develop new tools and new ways to administer these fabrics, as well as the new technologies, it's definitely something that needs to be maintained. As most of you know, just from a general documentation sense, if it's not maintained, it can become very outdated very quickly. And so, I did want to share that that is one of the useful tools that are out there now to maintain that. It is pretty easy to get an account on that wiki page. I have a link at the very end of the slide that can navigate you to get there if you're interested in helping maintain that wiki page as well. So feel free to follow that link at the end. So I did want to share just that that was an effort that the user community a few years back came together to try to develop with the OFA itself. So it's still a good tool, I think. It needs to be updated and kind of be probably more defined in ways for us to maintain that for the overall community itself. Another good way to kind of help get information out there is the user forums. I know a lot of people use different forums out there to kind of convey information and ask questions. I know the OFA itself has its own forum for any users of the OFA software itself, the OFA stack. And I know a lot of people have been using that the past couple of years, and that seems to be a very good way to at least convey issues and get some general feedback from the user community. And so that may be something that we want to expand on as well too, as we identify other types of resources out there and tools that we can use to kind of get everybody communicating on the same page. At the workshop this past year, different types of venues were presented as well too, like GitHub, perhaps, of ways to kind of consolidate forums and things like this in a more general sense. But there are many different tools out there that we can utilize as well too to make sure that we're not relying on many different types of communication venues out there that we get lost in the noise of where we should be asking these types of questions and or who will respond depending on where you're asking these questions. So I think there are a lot of us out there that can help utilize these tools and make use of them from our general workplaces, but it might be something that we just as a community need to come together and identify what is the best place to do that. Does it make sense to keep it with the OFA, or does it make more sense to kind of branch out and do something on our own with our own general presence on the internet, things like that. So many different ways that we can approach this from standardizing. And so that's the kind of the point of this forum, this webinar today is understanding what these differences are, and if anybody has any ideas that we can move forward with going forward, things like that. So, Divya, next slide, please. On top of that, there came the idea of that documentation is good and especially helpful for if you're diagnosing things or just looking for quick feedback on things as you're deploying them. But another venue that came out is why not training that we can get as a community itself. I know a few of the vendors provide some training for some of the technologies like InfiniBand, OmniPath, things like that. Those are very useful, especially when you're starting off. But is that something that we can kind of expand on and keep up to date with these changes, and or provide a more general training guide that can be more useful for understanding what RDMA is, how do you use it, how do you maintain it, what to look for when maintaining it, things like that. Some ideas came out with is, again, the OFA is a very good resource for us out there for understanding these technologies and software tools, things like that. Can they be the ones that help us identify good training venues and or provide training of their own to help us newbies coming into these technologies and how we utilize and understand it. But again, we talked about this is a good thing to keep up with and provide, but if it's not maintained and or kept up to date with these ever-changing world, it would be hard to kind of keep us all on the same page and make sure we get new updates out, things like that. So again, it's just time and resources that people need to provide to maintain something like this. And so there are drawbacks, again, of doing something like this and different ways that we can approach it. So, but that is one option that we can look at, whether it be with the OFA or some other external source as well too. Things like that is, again, always up in the air. Tutorial certifications, those are all things that many different types of technologies out there provide that are always useful, kind of hard to keep current for a lot of our day jobs, things like that, as again, things are upgraded and new ways of doing things are provided. This is something that we that might be a good idea, but again, is a very difficult thing to try to keep maintained as we provide this going forward. And it's something that many other different vendors for other different types of technologies provide. Does that make sense? Maybe to provide a already made type certification or OFA certification that will help us understand these technologies and certify us to help maintain these fabrics. We don't know. These are the open questions that we want to throw out to see what makes sense and what doesn't make sense. And then just in general, again, we keep talking about this, that there are many different types of venues out there to provide us with this information. The vendors, of course, are the biggest resource that we can have when we buy their products or utilize their products. It's just something that we can work with the vendors to help provide more information back to us and or a path in the community to help share their knowledge and resources across the community in general as well too. Can we give them the right feedback that we want to provide? Can they give us what we want in these different forums, things like that? It's one of the ever challenges that are difficult, especially with an ever-growing community of this type of technology. It's very, very quickly moving. Lots of new ideas, new tools, new ways to deploy these types of fabrics. It'd definitely be hard to kind of maintain that with across the different vendor community. But is that something that we can have as a path forward to help approach this idea of us trying to be in sync, both as a community and with the developers who are developing this technology going forward. Next slide, Divya. And so finally coming to what is this path forward that we want to approach. Again, we got a lot of good feedback from the OFA workshop this past year with the think tank of this idea still coming together both as a specific community and understanding these fabrics and the interoperability between them. What can we as a community do to make this happen? This webinar today, I think, is an excellent representation of us wanting to come back together and understand these challenges and want to provide feedback into it. Whether we solve these within this next year or if we ever solve them, that's up in the air. But as long as we're talking and discussing these items, I think there's always a possibility that we can kind of push for what we as a community want to see and maintain as far as understanding these technologies and documenting what we have and sharing that with the rest of the community. So the biggest aspect, again, is ongoing communication. Forums like this, webinars, are a great tool, I think, to help us come together and discuss these different options. Can these be shared across more people in the community? Can we get the word out more in different ways? One of the options that came up these past few months is there enough of a community support that maybe we develop our own working group that we can come together on a regular basis to discuss these ideas, share our own thoughts and concerns, maybe share some more information that we have that we want to get out to the community. I know there was a lot of good representation and push a few years back to do this as well too, and we did get a small community together that branched out from the OFA from the workshop that those past couple of years for us to kind of get together and share different ideas and share tools and resources that we had. But again, with our daily lives, that's just something that keeps falling off the table. But it's brought up again every single year at the workshop. And so is this something that we can kind of develop now as a community officially and say that, yes, we do want to come together. We do want to provide a venue for we as the community to come together to solve these different challenges that are coming up, whether it be something that we can solve quickly or not. I think just coming together overall is something that we want to make sure stays alive for us to work with. And then again, just staying active in this community as well too. We, I'm sure, come up with many different issues every single day at our daily jobs. It's just a resource and tool that we can develop very strongly that we can utilize on a day-to-day basis instead of waiting for more feedback from maybe support, things like that, that take usually a little bit longer. It's just something that we can just come together efficiently to be another just resource that we have besides Google, things like that. So, or whether we use Google or not, that's always up in the air as well too. Excuse me. And then again, just utilizing the workshop overall. I think we get a lot of good feedback every single year when we bring up topics like this. This past year, I think, was very useful with the idea of think tanks that came up. Excuse me. And I think there's a big push and a big cloud that hangs over our heads that we want to push for this. It's something that we do want to tackle. It's just, and that may not be the most opportune time with what else is going on in our daily lives. But is there something that we can do as a community that can slowly develop this easier? Can we develop a path at the OFA workshop every single year where we do come back, revisit a lot of these topics from our communication every year? Excuse me. If we have these different forums that we can come together with and kind of keep growing on every single year, is that something that we can come together as a community at the OFA workshops and provide more feedback and ways of interacting with these forums, things like that? Does it make sense to do more at the workshop where we have different tracks? We've done this the past a few years back of having a developer track and a user track at the workshop itself. And I think that was very beneficial. In the long run, I think it made more sense to try to keep the workshop together so we get that developer feedback when we as the user community come together to present issues and findings, things like that, and get that feedback where the vendors and the developers are, things like that. And then can we just have that venue overall as a good tool for us to physically come together and discuss new ways of approaching this idea and attack it from many different angles, things like that. So this is what I think we as a community can try to approach these issues. Like I said, whether we solve it with these ideas that we've came up with or other ideas that people present, things like that, I think is a very difficult thing. But that, I think, forums like this are a great way to kind of get lots of thoughts and share ideas, things like that. So next slide, please, Divya. So finally, like I said before, these are some very useful links that we've kind of developed the past couple of years through the OFA workshop in general. This first one is just a link to the OFA website where the user portal is. That's where you can find the wiki page, links to other different forums that the OFA provides, things like that. So if you're not aware of that, of the website in general, there's a link there for you to navigate to, and feel free to subscribe to any of those forum lists there, things like that you can utilize. And then the link right below is also on the website as well too, but I did want to point it out here. We as the think tank this past year did create our own mailing list as part of the think tank idea itself. And so a lot of people subscribe to this mailing list. So we thought it would be a good use case for us to again have a mailing list that we can utilize outside the forum as well too, just for general communication and ideas, and get word out to anybody who wanted to be a part of this mailing list as well too. So in addition to just the overall user community page, this is a nice link to get to the OFA sysadmin user community as well too. And whether this branches out into a working group as well too, that's always a possibility. And it's of course on the table for many different options on how we approach it. And with that, if you want to go to the next slide, Divya. So again, finally, the OFA is throwing another workshop again this next year in March. It always seems to be a very good, useful venue for us to come together, whether you're learning it for the first time, wanting to get more feedback from what you're dealing with, or just interested in to see how the technologies are developing from an overall sense of the RDMA community. It's always a nice place to kind of get together and understand these great challenges, and we can provide more feedback, things like that. So again, the workshop is this year, and I can have Divya provide more information as well too on top of this. But there is a call for sessions if anybody has any presentations or and/or information they want to share with the rest of the community. There are some dates there for when those are due. If you haven't already, go ahead and register for the workshop. I think we have a lot of cool things that we want to plan out for this year and understand from an overall topic point of view. So I think this is a good way to kind of get this out with this forum as well too. So especially we as the admins and users of this technology, it's always kind of an afterthought for when developers and the vendors come together to develop tools and resources for this technology. I think it's nice for us to always be there to help give that feedback back directly, not just through support pathways, things like that. So, and so with that, I wanted to kind of open up the floor, see if anybody has any general questions about how thoughts, questions on how this overall community might come together to provide more information. Was this useful? Things like
that. Jesse, if I could have the floor for just a moment.
Of course.
This is Paul Gruen speaking. Some of you on the call may not know me. I serve as the OFA's chair. I wanted to make a couple of points here that I think will be very supportive of the direction Jesse's going here. First of all, for the workshop this year, we've defined 4 major themes. And those themes kind of represent the areas in which the OFA is likely to spend a significant amount of its time focusing next year in 2019. One of those themes is system administration. So it just sort of emphasizes the point of the importance of the system administration topic and this issue that Jesse's driving. So if ever there was a time that the OFA is open and willing and receptive to this kind of an activity, this would be it. The second thing I wanted to point out was, again, in conjunction with the workshop, the idea of these 4 separate themes lends itself very, very well to the idea of creating an entirely separate track, if you will, not a separate track, but a track devoted to system administration style topics. That will be governed largely by the number and quality of the presentation proposals that the OFA receives for the workshop. So if you'd like to see a track devoted to system administration this year, the way to make that happen would be to submit proposals for topics about discussion related to system administration. The way that the tracks would be structured, if they were to exist, is each track would expect to be led off by a keynote of some sort, kind of setting the tone, and then a number of sessions, and then probably an open discussion session at the end, very much intended to encourage a lot of communication amongst the people in attendance. Just want to kind of make those points that, now is the time. The OFA is very open and willing and hopeful of supporting a greater emphasis on system administration, and the workshop this year is largely oriented towards accomplishing that goal. Thanks, Jesse.
Thank you, Paul. So again, if anybody has any thoughts or anything they want to say, this would be the time now. If you have any questions about any of the topics that we came up with that we're trying to solve, this would be a good venue to kind of get that information out there. Does anybody have any questions or thoughts?
Don't forget, if you have a question, to unmute yourself using the participants panel.
Yes, that's it.
We will make this presentation available as a PDF for folks who have registered, and we will also utilize the website to publish the recording and the website and the PDF. So stay tuned for that. If no other questions, we can have 15 minutes back, or I can hang on for 1 more minute, Jesse. Let's see if there are more questions.
So I have a question for people, those who are on now. For those who attended the workshop this past year and possibly attended the SysAdmin think tank, was that something of great use that that you found with trying to come together as a forum to approach these topics? Was there anything that you thought can be greatly expanded off that whether it be at the workshop or maybe something that's continuing throughout the year. And reminder, if you're on the Zoom application, reminder to unmute yourself if you haven't already.
Hello, I have a separate question not related to what you just asked. I'm sorry to move off that question, but I wanted to ask,
go ahead.
If we had questions later on, say a month from now or 3 weeks from now, where would the best place to be following up to it there? I know you posted a couple links at the end, but I wasn't sure how a discussion maybe could go on.
Yeah, so Divin, you can correct me if I'm wrong. We are going to share this presentation that does include the links. Again, one of those links did include a email subscription link that you can subscribe to that gets us gets you on the email list with the OFA sysadmin community. I helped maintain or deploy that when we were at the think tank this past year. We did have some good discussions during the workshop using that mailing list. And so I hope either that mailing list or Divi or Paul, I don't know if you have any other suggestions as to.
I think that is the best suggestion, Jesse. And I am sharing on the Zoom link right now. There is the mailing list, the sysadmin mailing list, which is still active. So you can click on this to subscribe and ask questions.
Thank you.
Bill, if I could ask you, this is Paul Gruen again speaking, sorry. If I could ask you, would there be interest in a working group that meets periodically, say monthly, to discuss issues like this? Would that create a greater contact point and make it easier for people to communicate, or would that just be an extra meeting you wouldn't want to go to?
Oh, that's a tricky question, because topics are interesting, but as people have alluded to, life takes over, and yeah, I mean, it sounds very valuable, and I would like to attend it. And monthly is a good cadence. Attend ones that are short half-hour ones. Those are the quick hit ones. Those are valuable kind of thing. Or if it even gets shorter because we don't have a topic to discuss, that seems valuable, I guess. I don't know. But yeah, does it add to your meeting list, and where can you squeeze it in and stuff is the other 1,000 questions.
The thing that I keep pondering is, how do you create a community? I mean, there's a lot of people out there, evidenced by the fact that a lot of people signed into this webinar today, for which I'm grateful. There's a lot of interest in this, but how do you create a community where communication can actually occur and the objectives of this community can be moved forward?
So Paul, this is Rupert Dance. I'd like to make a comment that I joined today sort of thinking that there might be more sort of technical content that was being presented here. And maybe that's a way to make this whole effort more valuable, that if we posted maybe once or twice a month, some common topics that people have trouble with, like, how to properly use OpenSM, or, congestion control in rocky networks, and things that both might help users solve problems and just be a resource that we could go to this site and find some useful topics in case we're struggling with issues. Is that a possibility to get things jump-started?
I would think so. If you're asking my opinion, it certainly seems like it. I think today's webinar was, partly to discover what the level of interest was. It was an extension to some extent of what I thought was a very successful town hall meeting at the workshop last year and the follow-on discussion that occurred, and to try to keep that momentum going and to try to form it, into something a little bit more cohesive that would actually produce results that you could use along the lines of what you've just suggested.
Yeah, and I guess, what I was sort of thinking, that if we start building a little content there, then, attending the monthly meetings might entice more people, because they grow to know, wow, here's a place I can get my questions answered, and, there's content there and things like that. I think that, if it was a learning experience for everybody, I think it would have more value.
And like I said, we have done things in the past like that, which I thought was very useful. After the few of the workshops the past couple of years, we did try to come and present different tools and resources that we as the sysadmin community were developing. I know Los Alamos did a few presentations. I think Sandia did as well on a few other sites. But like we said with our data lives, it kind of just takes over, and it's hard to kind of keep that going. But me personally, I found a lot of good use out of that. I think it was nice to have people present ideas and thoughts like that, and they were technical. They were to the extent of what that site was providing. But again, was just a monthly kind of get together to say, this is what we're doing here. This is how we approach issues and thoughts, things like that. So that could be something we develop again to be more technical from your point of view.
Sounds great.
You know, I made a play a minute ago for people to submit proposals for sessions to be presented at the workshop, but that may not be appropriate for some. In some cases, there may be topics that you would like to see addressed that you don't have the skill or the background, but this is something that would interest you. I have two suggestions there that may help. One would be, you know, float that idea on the sysadmin mailing list that's on the screen here. The idea about, you know, this is something that I'm curious about and would really help me if I saw a presentation on it. And that may stimulate someone else to pipe up and offer some information on that topic or even a session proposal. The other suggestion that I would make is that there's a high emphasis at the workshop on BOFs. Again, the whole idea is about collaboration, having people, providing an opportunity for people to put their heads together and, you know, and pool their knowledge, if you will. If there's a topic that you think would benefit from a BOF, by all means, please propose one through the workshop that we provided that facility, and we'd be more than happy to support a BOF that would enable that kind of conversation.
And just a note as well, I am on the board that helps to select these different topics for the workshop as well. So there is a sysadmin voice on that community to push forward. So what I can do is I can spark up some conversations on my mailing list. If anybody does have ideas and thoughts that they want to maybe provide and aren't sure about how to get it either into the workshop or maybe leading up into a working group in general, I can kind of help voice that those thoughts and opinions as well too. To the TPC board and the OFA community as well, to see how we can approach this, whether it be these monthly meetings or different tracks, as Paul put it, at the workshop in general, and or BOFs that we can hold at these workshops. So that could be one venue.
So Jesse, if I may, I'd like to, rather than write up a proposal, I'd like to make a couple of suggestions here. I think that it's perennially always useful for, you know, tools like OpenSM. I mean, that's a very complex tool. I know that Hal Rosenstock has presented it in the past, and I think that's a great tool to understand better from a user point of view, and I think that could be a topic. And I guess the other topic that I think is appropriate for the OFA would be a discussion of, you know, when and where to use libfabrics verbs, what the difference is, what they target and why that has value, and, you know, just understanding the structure from a user's point of view of libfabrics, that, you know, it's a high-level API that has many different providers and it can support a verbs provider, and when it's appropriate to use it and when not, and what are the benefits. I think there's potential confusion in the marketplace about verbs and libfabrics. So those are
I agree with that. Yeah, I agree with that completely. I did write those down, so I'll definitely make that as a note of topics that we can discuss.
Great.
Rupert, as
One other.
Sorry, just a thought on Rupert's comments. So this webinar series, the plan is to continue this, and in fact, libfabrics, Sean Hefty is the co-chair for OFA, and the plan was to invite him to be a presenter in this webcast if possible in the near future. So stay tuned on details.
Yeah, and I participate in the OFA WIG, and I enjoy that and get value from a developer's point of view, but I don't see it as being presented to that community as from a user's point of view, and that's really more what I was looking for.
Okay.
Focus on the user, on the end user, not the developers.
Got it. Thank you.
So one of the other topics that has been talked about in the IWG for the Interop group as being potentially something that might be of interest during the workshop is actually kind of the augmentation to the test plan, which would be following up from what will be the January logo event, and getting a lot of input, or as much input as possible, from the user community of test cases that would be useful in terms of stressing interop between various HCAs and such and fabrics, that then would feed into the debug testing and then the following logo event in the later half of 2019. So that's something that Paul and I brought up on the last call a week ago.
Lincoln, I'm glad you mentioned that, because that's a second of the 4 themes for the workshop this year is the interop.
Yep. Yeah, I think the tentative plan is that we're going to be presenting on the work that's coming out of the January, or what will hopefully be right around the January timeframe for the logo event, as well as kind of planning for the second half of 2019 and the follow-on event. But I think that presenting is one thing. What would be really, really valuable would be to get a lot of feedback from the user community of what additional things they'd like to see in the testing. What things have been pain points in their networks where they actually have kind of these heterogeneous fabrics that they're working on that could have been caught a lot earlier, in the testing program.
Sounds like a topic for a workshop off.
Yep, exactly.
Okay, other thoughts, comments?
Lincoln, just expanding on your idea, assuming now that since you proposed it, you'll lead this BOF, perhaps a slight, review and discussion of, the available testing within the RDMA community. So, as you know, the IBTA has a program, the CIWG program, and I think there's, some confusion as to what the focus on the 2 groups is. And as you know, the CIWG is more focused on physical layer, and the OpenFabrics program is more focused on interoperability and ULPs and testing of all kinds, testing the OFED stack. That could all be, I think, good topics within that BOF, and would help the community understand those resources.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and part of that was kind of the vision I think we had was first starting off the whole track with kind of a presentation of where we got to in January, what's been tested, what's included in that testing. What does it mean? How can it be consumed? Where can users go and look at those results and stuff like that? And then following that on with kind of, like I said, the planning or the what's next to kind of continue augmenting and growing that resource.
Sounds great.
Okay, we're at the end of the hour almost, so I'd like to take a moment to thank Jesse for his time and all the other attendees. I hope you found this valuable. Please submit any feedback you have to the MWG working group, or you can also write an email to the presenter if you like. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all very much.
Thanks a lot, Jesse. This is great.